Welcome back. Episode 2, KILMAINHAM Jail in Dublin, Ireland. We left off with this image that on the upper level of the panel you see an unruly jail, thereby making the visual connection to transportation, which is the shipment of prisoners elsewhere. Now, I'm going to engage in a bit of technique in narration known as foreshadowing. That is to give a little bit of information in advance of a much larger plot line later. Because in other videos in this series, we're going to visit Australia, down under, where we're going to see the other end of this campaign to transport prisoners. But let's contemplate how transportation was organized and administered in Ireland. This is a very important part of the history of KILMAINHAM. Let's see what the curators tell us. Over 4,000 people were transported to Australia by way of KILMAINHAM. From the early 19th century, the jail was a collection depot for transportees in the eastern and northeastern counties of Ireland. The pressure of these prisoners contributed directly to the problem of overcrowding until the practice was finally ended in the 1830s. By the early 1850s, with Mountjoy becoming available for long-term offenders, many of the transportation sentences were commuted in terms of penal servitude. Transportation from Ireland ceased in 1858. The nature of the crimes for which the sentences of transportation were handed down varied greatly. This was due to the judiciary's arbitrary attitude and sentencing. Arbitrary sentencing. In so many books about transportation from Ireland to Australia, historians have reminded us of the significance of the Irish being doubly damned and sent to Australia from Ireland because, among other things, they were being sentenced by British courts in Ireland that were arbitrary, fundamentally unfair. That will feed into other aspects of Irish culture. But let's spend a moment reflecting on another tragic chapter in Irish history, the Great Famine, often known as the Hunger. The immediate cause of the Great Famine from 1845 to 1849 was a failure through blight of the potato crop, the staple food of the majority of people. Over 1 million died of starvation or associated illnesses, and another 1.5 million emigrated. Like other institutions tuned to the fortunes and sufferings of the poor and the dispossessed, such as workhouses, poorhouses, and asylums, Irish prisons acted as barometers of desperation as the disaster grew. The government proved inadequate in dealing with the crisis. Nothing illustrates this more than the Vagrant Act of 1847. Intended to clear the streets of unsightly poor, its effects was to swamp the prisons with those found begging in the streets. In prison, they were either saved by the luxury of a meager but life-saving prison diet or succumbed to the disease-ridden, overcrowded conditions. Clearing the streets of unsightly poor. This is what sociologists refer to as social sanitation. doesn't deal with the problem. It just gets it out of view. It hides it, tries to conceal it. Economic forces figure prominently in incarceration, and they always have, and they always will. Okay? This is an important example of how economic disaster is deeply embedded in over-incarceration. You might remember in the last episode I talked about how this exhibition space utilizes technology to give us a sense of modern delivery of information. And here we see this video monitor that's also giving us information about the past. James McDonald, 18 years of age, plasterer, in possession of stolen peas and apples. He was sentenced to KILMAINHAM for 14 days. Possession of stolen peas and apples. This is what we oftentimes refer to in criminology as survival crimes. Quite literally, engaging in what is regarded as rule breaking of stealing food to feed oneself. Poverty. Betty O'Toole, 56, no trade, in possession of stolen potatoes. She got 2 days. To the British courts. Thank you very much. Okay. And here we see an illustration. The tragedy of the famine. Consider the huge volumes of Irish into America, Canada, elsewhere, just to survive. It's oftentimes said that the Irish were not so much immigrants to the U.S., but actually economic migrants. Had they stayed in their homeland, they may not have survived this period of history. By one estimate, in the 1850s, a census had reported that 25% of the population in New York City in the 1850s was Irish-born. You can get your head around that figure. 25% Irish-born, not second generation or first generation American, but Irish-born. KILMAINHAM, storytelling institution, political history. It's hard to separate the significance of KILMAINHAM as a cultural institution from its political history. Irish politics, exceedingly important in the larger narration of KILMAINHAM. So, I invite you to join me up the stairs. In museum studies, we oftentimes talk about navigation, locomotion, how visitors to museums actually move about, whether it's through a direct itinerary or one that's a little bit more open-ended. Locomotion, museum studies sometimes refer to it as the mind on legs. The mind on legs. Walk about the institution, the museum. We're taking in poster boards, and stories, and performance, and so on and so forth. The rebel tradition. The Irish have a reputation for a rebellious worldview to correct the injustices not only against the Irish people, but also other groups who have been subject to repression. In KILMAINHAM, can be found a potent blend of fact and symbol. Leading figures in every rebellion against British rule since 1798 are associated with the jail. While their imprisonment or death here represents the idea of freedom achieved through its sacrifice. Patrick Pearse spent the months leading up to the climactic rebellion of Easter 1916 drawing together all the previous efforts at independence into a seamless vision of persistent national aspiration and self-sacrifice. In this vision, the key events were heroic gestures in arms in 1798, 1803, 1848, 1867. Since the 1970s, against the backdrop of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, this reading of Irish history has been challenged by many historians who see it as selective and dangerously misleading. Nevertheless, an understanding of the tradition of Irish nationalism and republicanism in its own terms remains essential in the process of developing a fresh perspective on this mainstream current in modern Irish history. We have more videos scheduled to examine Belfast, where we will once again return to the Troubles of the 1970s, 80s, into the 90s. This is an important reference to the history of struggle. Patrick Pearse, a household name in Irish history. And we have the 1916 Rising, a momentous event in Irish history. Let us pause and return to 1916 in episode 3.